All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Julia Maeda. Can we get a next slide, please? We are so pleased that you all could join us for this week's lecture in our 12-week didactic series, which brings lectures from experts in the field covering different topics each week. Next slide. The Neuropsychology Didactic Series was created by trainees and early career neuropsychologists to provide free, high-quality didactic opportunities. Next slide. We would like to thank our sponsors for their financial support for this series, including those listed here. Next slide. Before we start, here are the disclaimers for this series. So this training is not meant to replace formal education in neuropsychology, and the views of the speakers are their own. Next slide. Technical instructions. So questions can be submitted via the Q&A box on the lower left hand of your screen, which is next to the chat function. We'll address questions submitted to the speaker during the last 10 minutes of the talk, and a recording of today's lecture will be provided on our website later this week. All right, next slide. And then next slide, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Block for today's lecture on neuropsychology, history, and systems. Dr. Katie Block is a neuropsychologist and assistant professor within the Department of Neurology at Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. She completed her PhD in medical clinical psychology at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, which included a predoctoral internship at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. She then went on to complete her postdoctoral fellowship at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. Though highly active in clinical and scholarly endeavors, Dr. Block has a particular passion for working with neuropsychology students and trainees at all levels. She is highly involved in multiple national and international neuropsychology organizations, having previously served as chair of both the student and early career committees of the Society for Clinical Neuropsychology, in addition to other roles within the International Neuropsychological Society, National Academy of Neuropsychology, American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology, the Clinical Neuropsychology Synarchy, and the Epilepsy Neuropsychology Organization, or INS-SIG. She is a recipient of numerous awards, including the Early Career Service Award from the National Academy of Neuropsychology, a Presidential Citation Award from the Society for Clinical Neuropsychology, and Early Career Champion Award from the American Psychological Association, among others. She is the editor of an upcoming text, The Neuropsychologist Roadmap, a training and career guide, which will be released by APA Press early next year. I know we're certainly excited to see that. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Block.
Well, thanks for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I am so glad to be here talking about a topic that I find really fascinating. I knew when we were deciding on what talks to give, and this was absolutely one of the topics I felt strongly about including in our series. I think having a good foundation in the roots of our field and the approaches that our field has developed over time is critical for being a good neuropsychologist today and in the future. So just a rough agenda of what I'm going to talk about today. The bulk of the talk, as the title connotes, will be about neuropsychology in the past, but I am actually also going to include a few nods to where we are today as a field and maybe some inclinations about where our field might be headed in the future. So this is kind of the structure loosely that we'll be following. So neuropsychology in the past. Interest in the brain has dated back centuries for human beings. The earliest known recorded reference to the brain dates back to, I believe, the Second Dynasty in Egypt. There's a document that has since been named the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus. It's a medical document. It's named after the person that discovered it. That contains a series of case descriptions of various patients at that time. There's actually a hieroglyph that connotes the word brain, which is that one that you see on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And that hieroglyph occurs 8 times in the papyrus, particularly for in the case history of 2 patients who had compound skull fractures. Throughout these cases, the author of the document describes things that we would nowadays recognize as aphasia. So somewhere in the text it says things like, "He speaks not to thee," Also described are what sounds like seizures. He shudders exceedingly. So things that we might recognize today as sequela of brain injuries. So really long time ago. And since then, various approaches have risen and fell in popularity as scientific advances kind of moved us forward. We'll talk about all of these to some extent today, starting with, and I'll briefly describe these before we get into them. The first one being localization. So for a long period of time, where we started was this idea that parts of the brain were responsible for specific brain functions, that there was dedicated real estate in the brain to specific behaviors, aspects of cognitive processes, personality, intellect, and such. In response to that movement, something arose called connectionism, which was not just that there was one particular area of brain real estate responsible for these functions, but that the brain operated in systems, meaning two or more areas were communicating with one another to produce these functions. So these regions are interconnected in some way. There's also the concept of hierarchical organization, or our nervous system acts as an organized and interactive whole. There's kind of multiple operating functional hierarchies across several levels. And that was followed by equipotentiality, or the brain has the capacity to carry out functions lost by destructions to other parts, sort of like the brain co-ops damaged portions and sort of takes those over to do other functions of the brain. So again, this is just a brief definition, and we'll talk about all these in a little more detail, and individuals important to each of these movements. So let's start with localization. So again, moving just a little bit forward in time, Hippocrates believed the brain to be the seat of intelligence. So this was probably the first point, even though there had been some interest in the brain, the first point at which somebody recognized how critical the brain was to mental processes. Aristotle believed the heart to be the source of mental processes. So conversely, there was differing schools of thought at this time about what the brain actually represented. Hippocrates is probably pretty far ahead of his time compared to other individuals. Other individuals like Aristotle, it's not that they said that there wasn't a role for the brain, but the brain was really secondary to other parts of the body. And in his case, he believed the heart to be the source of mental processes. So the brain, while it had a role, it was really secondary. It was more of a radiator for cooling the heart and the blood so that they could do their job. He reasoned that humans were more rational than beasts or animals because they have a larger brain to cool their hot-headedness. So again, the brain, while it had a role, was fairly secondary. And moving to Alexandria, someone called Herophilus was known as the father of anatomy. He's actually one of the earliest people to perform human dissections. He rendered careful accounts of what we recognize today as the dura mater and the ventricular system. It's really a laundry list of things that this person identified. He distinguished the cerebellum from the cerebrum. He had made distinctions and identified both motor versus sensory nerves. Unfortunately, despite the wealth of his work, he actually had 9 published works, but they were all unfortunately destroyed in the destruction of the library at Alexandria about 8 years before his passing. But since then, they've been rediscovered to some extent. For a period of time after that, the human body was considered sacred. Some of that relates to papal law at the time, or other religious aspects, but essentially it was prohibited from use in dissections. So people found other ways to study human anatomy, and by virtue of that, the brain. Galen, who was a physician in Rome, initiated a movement that we may know today as localization of function. He assigned the role of rational thinking to the brain. The heart is where he saw more emotive or affective functions. And conversely, he felt that the gut had the role of appetitive functions or motivational drives. And while he conducted dissections, again, due to limitations in what they were allowed to do at the time, he primarily used pig dissections or animal dissections comparatively and drew inferences to humans. Now, that being said, he had a lot of students at the time, and he did encourage his students to study soldiers or gladiators that fell in the arena and passed away, or bodies that washed up on the shoreline. So kind of in a more removed sense, you know, externally they could study bodies, but certainly not in a dissection method. So our understanding of the brain as it moves forward, it doesn't always stem from, you know, Greece and Rome and Alexandria. Actually, some Islamic countries have some role to play here as well. There's an individual named Avicenna. He was in Persia, and he was known as actually the father of modern medicine. He wrote 40 different pieces on medicine, including one that was used for basically the next century as the standard medical encyclopedia used in universities. Amongst a number of other contributions, he identified and named things like the cerebellar vermis, or what he called just the vermis, and also the caudate nucleus, which now today we recognize as a critical part of the basal ganglia. He also explained phenomena in addition to neurologic issues like dementia, epilepsy, stroke, tremors. He had an interest in mental health, and some of the earliest mental health disorders started to be recognized by him, including he described something we would know today as schizophrenia, mania, sleep disorders like insomnia. So he's a very busy guy. One of my favorites in terms of the history of all of this is somebody named Andreas Vesalius. So again, you can see we're moving forward in time here. He's probably what we would consider one of the most influential modern anatomists. His most famous body of work, arguably, is the De Humani Corporis Fabrica. It's really just a beautiful text. I always like to share this anecdote with my trainees when I go over this topic. And when I was in graduate school at University of Alabama, Birmingham, the medical school actually has a medical school library. So if you're ever attached to a medical school, wherever you are, they may have something like this that's worth checking out. But they had rotating exhibits, and it was always really interesting things. The curators there were great. One time they had Harry Potter and the Wizarding World, so they had different recipes and different textbooks for concoctions and potions. And they actually had an exhibit that came through at one point, I think my second or third year there, on anatomy. And they actually had an original copy of this De Humani Corporis Fabrica. It was a humongous book. And as you can see in the drawings I have here to the side, he produced these really incredibly detailed drawings because he conducted dissections on human cadavers. So instead of animals at this point, he was actually using real humans that had passed. But he drew these just beautiful drawings of the human anatomy in general, but also brain anatomy. And at this exhibit, the curator was showing us the book, and the pages are so brittle and frail that nobody was actually allowed to touch them except the curator, and he wore special gloves so that the oils in your finger didn't ruin the pages. But it was really just a fascinating experience, and just to see how long ago this interest stems. So again, dissections were, at this time, were against papal law, but Vesalius, I guess, was sort of a renegade in this means. He could sort of skirted around that. He performed dissections anyways. He actually obtained cadavers through lots of different means, some of which weren't always exactly legal. So you hear of the term grave robbers. So, sometimes individuals at this time would contract people to unearth bodies, and then they would use those in cadaver dissections. So not always the most legal means, but we still learned a lot. And when he and Herophilus did dissections, they were often public. So this is an example of some of the dissection arenas that you might have seen across various times, Herophilus being probably more like the top left. At the time of Vesalius, there's probably more like the bottom left and the one on the right. So as you can see, there's these ginormous theaters. The public could come in, the students could come in, they would sit and watch what's being done down at the bottom as the person, whoever it is at the time, Herophilus or Vesalius, was talking them through the dissection. It's fascinating. So after antiquity and after Renaissance, this was followed by a more modern period, but still this continued an emphasis on localization. Whereas Renaissance scientists were focused on finding just a single brain area that underlied all mental functions, more modern scientists like Florence were focused on localizing specific functions like motor functions. That was a big area of interest at that time. And that's him there in that photo. A lot of you probably, if you haven't heard of Gaul or phrenology, you've probably seen this drawing here. A lot of us neuropsychologists have the phrenology head on their bookshelf, and I'm no exception. Actually, mine's a piggy bank, so that's kind of fun. So Gaul, in the 1700s, 1800s, actually originally he founded something called craniology, and this was a field. Its initial attempt was to tie skull morphology, so like the bumps and grooves and dips in the outer surface of your skull, to traits like intellect, mentation, or cognitive skills like memory, and other things like personality traits. So you can see from the photo here, he had them grouped by domain. So posteriorly, you had things related to aspiring traits like conscientiousness, cautiousness, firmness, self-esteem. More anteriorly, you had perceptiveness, things related to your perception of time, locality, color, lots of different things. And his observations, funnily enough, stemmed from his schoolmates. So he noticed when he was in school that some of his schoolmates who seemed to have really good memories for what they were learning in class also had eyes that protruded, which to me seems kind of strange, but there you have it. And this theory was roundly rejected by contemporary neurologists like Florence, Magendie, and Rolando. Some of you who may have some neuropsychology background already, or at least know a little bit about anatomy, might recognize a couple of those names. Magendie, of course, is named for the foramen of Magendie, which is part of the ventricular system, and Rolando being the Rolandic fissure in the brain. So while they roundly rejected, he did find quite a few fans of this theory. So as the field developed further, he gathered students and trainees. One of his proteges was somebody named Johann Spurzheim. So again, now we're in the 17 to 1800s. And he renamed the craniotomy to phrenology. And so that's where that name came in. And essentially, Spurzheim and Gaul would travel around. They traveled to Paris, to Germany, to other countries, and they would essentially do these demonstrations. Gaul essentially was the one doing all the educating and highlighting the work and interpreting the findings. At the same time, Spurzheim would either be doing dissections or actually using the calipers, which are those tools you see on the top of the head right there. Those are venial calipers, to actually do the measurement piece. So Spurzheim, really took this work and ran with it. He attempted to grow the field's credibility and legitimacy by founding its first scientific journal, which is called the Phrenological Journal. The field grew pretty rapidly in popularity, both in America and in Europe. So phrenology, by the 1980s, London alone had more than 28 phrenological societies. There was also multiple journals. So in addition to Phrenological Journal, there was an American Phrenological Journal, for example. So, pretty wide popularity. It's died off since then, but even as recently as the 1970s, there were still books being published on this topic. So, a lot of times when we learn about phrenology in the context of neuropsychology, it's sort of gets this wink and a nod about medical quackery and things like that. But, Gaul's writings weren't totally without influence. He published a series of papers in the 1800s that actually localized speech to, quote unquote, the convolutions of the interior aspect of the frontal lobes, which, if you know neuroanatomy already, or if you listen a little further ahead in my talk, Paul Broca also recognized that this was the area that speech came from. So, some of his observations weren't completely without merit. But a lot of the legacy of phrenology ultimately was tainted. People took it and applied it to justify colonialism, racism. Nazis used it to discriminate between Aryans and non-Aryans. So there's really contentious history in how this was applied. And of course, the science has moved on since then. So I mentioned Paul Broca. So many of you may recognize this name. And if not, you may have heard of something called Broca's area, which is in the brain. So Paul Broca was a neurologist, and he spent many years advancing the study, actually, funny enough, of physical anthropology, which when you look at the definition of physical anthropology, it's actually not all that different from phrenology in a way, or at least the roots of phrenology, measuring the surface of the skull, measuring facial features in this instance. So Paul Broca's early years, he published over 200 papers on this topic, and he actually developed or invented the craniometer, I could say that, to actually measure those face dimensions and skull dimensions. Ultimately, he moved past that work. What he's most famous for is a series of case studies, in particular one patient. I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation, but Louis Laborge was probably his most famous patient. You all may know him more as Tan or Tan. And the reason why this gentleman had that name was because it's actually a pretty sad story. He was stuck in this hospital in France for 21 years. He's a pretty sick individual. And over those 21 years, he had this progressive deterioration of his speech, ultimately to the point that by the time he came to the attention of Dr. Broca, all he could really say was Tan. In actuality, even though we say Tan, most of the time when he would talk, it would be in doubles. So he would say Tan Tan most of the time. So Broca studied this individual, and ultimately he passed away, and they did a post-mortem autopsy, and they found, just as he had suspected, that there was this lesion in the inferior frontal lobe, which actually, this is a photo of Tan's brain here that you can see. And as you can tell, there is this kind of like decay or deterioration of brain tissue in that area. And so that's kind of today what we would recognize as Broca's area, where speech, articulated speech, comes from. Funny enough, if you want a historical factoid to share at your next cocktail party, Tan could actually say more than just Tan or Tan. He also could just a little bit use profanity. So he was known to say, Sacre nom de Dieu, which I'll leave you to look that up online what that means. But there was very few things he could say, but that was one of them. Okay. I have a few interesting case studies peppered throughout this presentation. This is probably one of the more famous ones that folks have heard of, even outside of neuropsychology. So Phineas Gage in the 1800s, this is in America now. He was an American railroad foreman who sustained an orbital frontal brain injury following a work accident involving a tamping rod. So on the railroad at that time, what these large groups of workmen would do is they would have this piece of ground. They would create holes in the ground. These tamping rods are what hold down the bars of the railroad. And to get deep enough to actually hold down these bars so that trains could cross them without them falling apart, they had to pack down lots of like TNT and explosives and then basically blow it so that this giant hole in the ground could be made. And this tamping rod was what helped create that hole. So unfortunately, for whatever reason, he was standing over it, this thing blew at the wrong time, and it kind of went up through his chin into the under area of his frontal lobe. For all purposes, the man should have passed with that kind of injury, but somehow he survived. Interestingly enough, his personality behavior changed. So the one neat thing and very helpful thing about Phineas Gage is that we actually do have a pretty detailed case history on him. The physician that he saw that treated him during the course of his accident and for years thereafter was J.M. Harlow. And he had the foresight and kind of astuteness to go ahead and take detailed observations of Phineas. So he noted that his behavior and personality changed from being kind and even-tempered to impulsive, irritable. At times he was even profane, very much unlike the person that he was before the injury. And again, this is a person that had been promoted up to the position of foreman. So somebody who's impulsive and irritable and profane with others probably wouldn't have been promoted to that level. As J.M. Harlow says, historically, Phineas was accustomed to entertain his little nephews and nieces with the most fabulous recitals of his wonderful feats and hairbreadth escapes without any foundation except in his fancy. He had a fondness for pets and souvenirs, especially for children, horses, and dogs, only exceeded by his attachment to the actual tamping iron itself, which was his constant companion during the remainder of his life. So not only, was this gentleman, sort of disinhibited enough to go around telling a story to anybody he would meet, he would travel with that rod itself, and that's what you see holding in the photo. So that the rod itself is very large, I think like up to 12 feet. And he used to pose for photos with it. Really fascinating case. Folks have actually gone back and tried to do like an MRI rendering of what the injury might have looked like. And so if you were, not that imaging was around at that time, but had it been, this is what you might have seen. So as you can see, the tamping rod flew up through the skull and into the under portion of the frontal lobe, which we call orbital frontal cortex, because it sits right around the orbit of the eyes and the skull. Okay. So this case study really told us a lot about how those frontal lobes are responsible for controlling behavior and emotion. So self-regulation of behavior, planning, organization, reasoning, problem solving. Moving ahead. So another individual worth mentioning, this is a little bit of an aside from those larger, broader movements historically that I was talking about earlier. But somebody I think that's just fascinating, and as a neuropsychology trainee or just a student of the brain, you may want to do more reading about this person, is Santiago Ramon Cajal, who was a Spanish neuroscientist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And up till now, we've been really talking about the brain in sort of a macro sense. Let me take a moment and go micro. So he furthered our understanding of the brain really at the cellular level. One of the more famous aspects of his work was that he wrote and researched on neuron theory. So he was able to demonstrate that neurons weren't actually continuous, but contiguous. So at that time, the thinking was that neurons were just connected all throughout physically. But now we know that there's actually this space, the gap between neurons. And that's that gap that feeds out and filters and uptakes those neurotransmitters, which is how cells communicate with each other, right? So Ramon Cajal was one of the reasons why we discovered this. He also advocated for the existence of dendritic spines. He also advocated for, this idea that there was time or learning dependent growth of cells, which was sort of new at the time. One of the cells that he identified was the Purkinje cell, which is in the cerebellum, which is that beautiful drawing that you see behind him. All that dendritic branching representing the massive amount of information flow that goes in and out of the cerebellum. And he won a lot of awards. Really, it's too many to even put on this presentation with multiple slides, but probably the most important one was the Nobel Prize. Okay, moving on. So up to now, we've been talking a lot about localization. We're going to move ahead now and talk about, just for a few minutes, about the equipotentialists and the connectionists. So Florence was a major opponent of Gaul. Remember the phrenology individual that we talked about a minute ago. He disagreed with localizationist views of the brain. A lot of his work was animal studies. In particular, he did ablation studies where he would artificially create a lesion and then monitor said animal for effects behaviorally and cognitively. He came to the conclusion that brain functions, rather than being tied to like specific real estate in the brain, that they were actually diffusely represented in the brain, and that loss of function depended on the extent in totality of damage to the brain, not the specific location itself. Okay. A colleague, not necessarily contemporary, but a colleague in terms of belief in this equipotentiality was Karl Lashley, and he expounded that all areas of the brain are equally able to perform a task. Part of this equipotentiality that he proposed was something called the mass action principle, which is that complex brain function is reduced proportionately to how much damage the brain as a whole has sustained, not any one area, which is similar to what I just mentioned with Florence. And actually, in this theory, intact cortex can assume responsibility of the functions of damaged brain area. So, when you look at the time period that Lashley and going back to Florence was alive, the 1718, early 1900s, this predates imaging. Things like CT and MRI and PET and SPECT and EEG, all the more modern ways that we can picture the brain and see and gain that understanding. So now we know, you think to like V.S. Ramachandran's work on neuroplasticity, where he studied the people with phantom limb syndrome who had lost limbs, from injuries or combat. And when you study the brains of these individuals, you can actually see changes in the mapping of what part of the brain controls that function. So the brain actually, plastic means moldable, shapeable. The brain actually is shaping itself to adjust and accommodate to the loss of that limb. And so here we go, decades before imaging came about, and this person arrived at this understanding that this actually can happen. Intact cortex takes over responsibility of damaged cortex. So there's no loss of function, even if there's loss of brain tissue. Pretty fascinating stuff. So those are the ecopotentialists. There's also the connectionists, which evolved in response to the localizationists. So one probably most famous name that you might recognize here would be Karl Wernicke, who noted that a lot of people think about language and they think about him. That's true. He noted the temporal lobe to also be involved in language, specifically the function of comprehension. So while Broca was articulation of speech or the output, Wernicke was more of the input or the kind of intake and understanding of language, which makes sense because when if you know about brain real estate and what's located where, Wernicke's area, as it's come to be known, the comprehension area, which is in the superior posterior part of the temporal lobe, is actually co-located right next to the primary auditory cortex or Heschel's gyrus. Okay. So he noted that Broca's area was actually connected to this Wernicke's area via a thick band of white matter fibers called the arcuate fasciculus. So if you look at the little schematic over here, the one on top is Wernicke's original model. The little yellow area on his model is what represents the arcuate fasciculus. So the blue dot is going to be Broca's area, the purple dot at the end of that is going to be Wernicke's, and the yellow area, arcuate fasciculus, connects those two. So that way, that explains how we go from hearing sounds, processing it, understanding it, to being able to output a response. And he said that this is what disproves a strict localizationist view on language. So there's not just this one area of the brain that's responsible for language. There's actually more than one, and not only that, but they're actually connected. And if you disconnect those areas, that really does something to that function. This model was later updated by somebody we'll talk about in a second here, Norman Geschwind, who's a behavioral neurologist. So sometimes when you hear about Wernicke's model of speech, you might hear it referred to as the Wernicke-Geschwind model, and that's where that comes from. And that's the more contemporary model that we have down here below, where, starting off, we have sound sensations that enter the brain through that auditory pathway and the auditory cortex, which again is co-located next to Wernicke's area, sent over to Broca's area for articulation. And again, Broca's area, I didn't mention this, but it's co-located right next to the motor cortex of the brain. And when you think about speech, that makes a lot of sense because it's a very motoric activity. You're having to coordinate movement of your mouth, your breath, your tongue, the rest of your throat muscles. Okay. So the disagreement between experiments up to this point that support localization of function versus those that don't, like the connectionist theories, ultimately was resolved by something called hierarchical organization proposed by the English neurologist Jackson. He noted that higher functions themselves weren't actually unitary, because really up to this point, that's sort of what they were talking about. He said, well, these higher functions are made of smaller units, which makes sense, because if you want to take, say, language, because we've been talking about Broca and Wernicke, if you want to take language as an example, you can actually break that down into smaller units. So language isn't a unitary thing. It's actually composed of a lot of different facets like reception, expression, repetition, speech sounds, motor programs. And loss of function can result in damage to any one of those areas. And loss of that area causes impairments in all kinds of higher functions that might depend on that area. So for example, depending on what part of the speech pathway that you hit, you could get aphasia. Aphasia means loss of language, but it all depends on where you're hitting in that pathway. If the lesion's right on Broca's, you might have an expressive aphasia. If it's on Wernicke's, you might have a receptive aphasia. If it's on the arcuate fasciculus, you might have a loss of, say, repetition. And areas that are surrounding Broca and Wernicke's, cause certain types of aphasia presentations in and of themselves. Likewise, he said behavior exists on multiple levels. There's voluntary and automatic behavior. Again, taking the example of language, you can break that into voluntary language, but we also have automatic speech. A really interesting phenomena for those of you who either work in inpatient currently or train in inpatient rotations in the near future. If you have the opportunity to run into a patient with aphasia. So if this person isn't able to speak, but you say, I want you to sing along with me, twinkle, twinkle, little star. So that's an example of automatic speech. Or, say the days of the week with me, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. This patient who's aphasic and literally can't talk or understand suddenly can do that same task right along with you. So that's an incredible example of that. There's this interaction between these behaviors. One of my favorite historical neuropsychologists is Alexander Luria. He's a Russian neuropsychologist / neurologist, kind of a Renaissance man, really. He used bedside testing to lateralize and localize brain lesions. And so this is him in action in the photo. At this time, so when you think about what was happening between 1902 and 77, at the peak of his career really was World War I, and there were these Russian soldiers who sustained combat injuries. They had traumatic brain injury, and he worked in the hospital seeing these soldiers with these injuries. And again, operating at a time before imaging was a thing, was able to deduce volumes of information about the brain that are still, I think, pretty spot on today. One of the things that he noted was that the brain operates in separate but interacting functional units. So earlier I mentioned in terms of the approaches that we're looking at, this hierarchical function. So this is what I would describe to Luria. It's more of like a subtype of connectionist theories. So it's not that there was like these disparate parts of the brain or just this one part, but really the brain is kind of interconnecting at multiple levels. And I'll show you an example of what I mean. But each of these interacting what he called functional units were hierarchically organized into zones. So if I was going to take an example just to show you what I mean, his first unit was something called the Unit 1, the subcortical unit. What this corresponds to nowadays neuroanatomically is the ascending reticular activating system. And the responsibility of this unit, he said, was to regulate tone and arousal or awakening, which makes a lot of sense because the reticular activating system, that's literally what it does. It regulates tone, it regulates our arousal and awakening. If you have damage or injury to this area, you could get a disorder of consciousness, for example. Unit number 2 is the sensory unit, and he proposed that this is the unit responsible for obtaining, processing, and storing information, which makes a lot of sense because, boy, when you look at where a lot of these primary sensory areas are, they're at the back of the brain. So the whole occipital lobe is responsible for vision. Remember that Heschel's gyrus or primary auditory cortex, that's also posterior. So really that's kind of where information comes in the brain. Moving to anteriorly in the brain is the third unit, which he said was the motor unit. And here he said this one was responsible for programming, regulating, and verifying activity, which makes a lot of sense because when you think about what's up there in the frontal lobe is the motor cortex, is the frontal lobe itself, which is responsible for producing action and regulating action. Okay, so just to use an example of what I mean, because you might be hearing me say that and going, well, how does that relate? Can you give me like a real world example? Yes, I can. So thinking about the example of reading a book, okay? So using the Lurian hierarchical model, first you hit that primary visual cortex where you perceive color, shapes, angles. That's really, again, that sensation, information processing and reception. Next, you send it to a secondary association area where you elaborate what you're perceiving visually from sensation to symbolic processes, like recognizing this is a book and these are letters. And that area where that red dot is hitting is near an area called the planum temporale, which is the juncture of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes, which is where you get things like comprehension, reading, things like that, auditory processing. And then that flow of information moves from primary to secondary to what we call a tertiary or multimodal integration area. And that keyword is integration. So this is where everything that you've seen and associated that information with from what you already know gets translated into intention or action. So in this example, you're reading chapter 1 of your book. So it's a little complicated, but essentially, again, there's these 3 functional units. and they operate in these 3 different zones, the primary, secondary, and tertiary. So using this example, hopefully I can help highlight that. If you're interested in this and you want to learn more about Luria, one of my favorite books historically, and I've got it on my bookshelf, is The Working Brain. So if you look online on Amazon, it's still in print. It's a little dense at times, but it's a fantastic book. And again, to me, really impressive because he arrived at a lot of things that are still considered correct today, absent of more modern like imaging type methods. It was actually somewhere around this time that the term neuropsychology itself came into existence. It was first used by Karl Lashley in 1936, and then Donald Hebb came up with a 1949 text that actually had it in the title, The Organization of Behavior and Neuropsychological Theory. It started to become a recognized subfield in the late 50s. It gained more widespread use in the 1960s, and on until we are here today. So we're getting more into the 1900s here. So remember a few minutes back, I mentioned Norman Geschwind. So he was a Harvard-trained American neurologist. In the early 1960s, he established the Boston University Aphasia Research Center, which was a cooperative between Boston University and the Boston VA. And I believe the Aphasia Research Center is still there today. When he established it alongside neuropsychologist Edith Kaplan. And normally here is where I like to stop my trainees and pester them with questions. Well, what do we know about Kaplan? What was she famous for? And some of you in the talk may be going, clock drawing. So if you've ever seen a clock drawing or done a clock drawing with a patient or read about clock drawing, Edith Kaplan is strongly associated with that. Geschwind's legacy is continued through the work of all of his many, many trainees, including some famous names. So even if these people didn't directly train under him, they sort of share that lineage. So people like Kenneth Heilman. So if any of you have the Neuroanatomy Through Clinical Cases book on your shelf, there's also Antonio Damasio, author of The Bicameral Mind, amongst other things, Marcel Mesalem, and a whole host of others. In 1965, he authored a book called The Disconnection Syndromes in Animal and Man. Built on the work of Wernicke, Liepman, and Desjardins, Geschwind outlined how white matter pathway lesions disrupt communication between brain regions. So this kind of harkens back to the connectionist model. And so just kind of a little graphic here to show you that there's these fiber types, association fibers, commissural fibers, projection fibers, and depending on the tract that gets disconnected, it results in a specific neuropsychological syndrome. So you probably recognize arcuate fasciculus because that's one I keep going back to as an example in today's lecture. But disconnection of that could result in specific kinds of aphasia, like a conduction aphasia. There is a corpus callosum, which is a large swath of white matter fibers that connect the left hemisphere with the right hemisphere, and disconnection of that can result in left-hand apraxia or left-hand agraphia. It's a difficulty writing or performing kind of programmed movements. Okay, so just some examples of some disconnection syndromes historically. So ultimately, you had this camp of localizationists that really couldn't explain why lesions in different areas of the brain produce similar deficits. And you had these equipotentialists kind of falls under connectionists that couldn't explain why patients with very circumscribed lesions manage very specific deficits. So ultimately today, kind of where we're at is this integrated functional model that combines those two approaches. So when you think about what you know already about neuropsychology, there are specific areas of the brain, you hit that spot and it's going to produce a really specific deficit. But in some areas of the brain, actually many areas of the brain, it's all kind of connected we think of the brain more nowadays as a network, right? And so lesion to anywhere along that pathway could result in a similar type of deficit, even if it's not hitting at that specific area itself. Okay. Going back to case studies. So another really famous case study you might be familiar with is HM, who we now know after his passing, they released his name to the public, and his name is Henry Molaison. When he was young, age 27, he was having these intractable seizures. Medication just wasn't able to control his seizures. So as sort of a last-ditch effort, him and his family went to a physician and said, what can we do? Is there surgery an option? So he underwent this radical surgery at that time to remove the medial temporal lobe, which is where the hippocampus is. And hippocampus, we know, is part of the memory network. So they took out both of those on both sides of the brain in an attempt to control the seizures. So fortunately, the good news is HM didn't really have seizures after that, but he did suffer from something called anterograde amnesia. So what this refers to is new learning. So HM, he could remember things about himself, where he grew up, what his name was, who his parents were, important events in his life, but any of the day-to-day kind of things he had a lot of trouble with. So if you gave him a magazine and then you gave him the same magazine 20, 30 minutes later, he'd read it like it was new, for example. One thing I really love about this case study is that this is a case study that involves a neuropsychologist. So there was a young neuropsychologist at that time named Brenda Milner, who discovered that he actually did retain some memory. So, everybody had sort of written him off as being densely amnestic. And by doing a series of tests over and over with him, she found that he retained some small amounts of working memory and some portion of what we call procedural memory for movements. And this is just a rendering of his brain, what it might have looked like before surgery and post-surgically with the removal of the medial temporal lobes. And they'll actually still do, temporal lobe resections for seizure surgery these days, but as the science and the technologies progressed, it's much more selective, and they take out much smaller portions of the brain to have that seizure control success. So up to this point, I'm like 47 minutes into my talk, and you're going, well, what about neuropsych assessment? You haven't even mentioned assessment yet. Well, that's true. So now I'd like to shift gears a little bit now that we've talked about kind of where the roots of neuropsychology are in understanding the brain, a little bit more towards the assessment side. So the word assessment itself comes from the Latin verb assidere, I'm probably mispronouncing that, meaning to sit with. So there's a long, interesting history to assessment. There's a whole wealth. I could do a whole presentation on its own of intellectual assessment, a whole presentation on achievement testing, a whole presentation on personality assessment. Unfortunately, I'm sure you guys don't want to sit with me for 4 hours, so that's out of the scope of today's lecture. But I will talk about more specifically some of the kind of systems approaches for neuropsych assessment. So over time, various testing approaches have been developed. There's the fixed approach, which essentially, and I'll talk about these in more detail, but that essentially means administering the same kind of set of tests to all patients, regardless of the referral. These tests are decided beforehand a priori. The focus here is on psychometrics. There's also, in contrast, the flexible approach, where testing and what tests get used really depends on the nature of the referral that's being sent to you, how that patient presents during clinical interview, what deficits the patient's telling you about or what you're seeing behaviorally. And that determines, again, the evaluation composition and the direction it goes in. Here, the focus is really on neurologic deficits, and that's what guides this whole approach. Then there's been, and I think this is probably what more people tend to practice these days, is a combination of the two, what we call a fixed flexible battery. So buzzword, when you go on your internship and fellowship interviews, if people say, what kind of testing approaches have you been exposed to? And you say, well, I've done a little bit of fixed, but mostly practice fixed flexible. And here's why, and here's what that looks like. You will impress the socks off your interviewers. So remember that, that's a tip. But essentially here, it's a core battery of tests, and then there may be some adjustment. You may take some tests off or add some tests, just based on, again, the referral, the presentation, the deficits. And I would say probably most neuropsychologists tend to practice that these days. But there are still people that take more of a fixed approach or a pure flexible approach. So talking about the fixed approach, automatically you should think of Ward Halstead. So he started the first lab to study brain behavior relationships at the University of Chicago. He collected tests that he deemed empirically sensitive to the presence of brain damage. And in this approach, patients all received the same tests in the same order. And this really laid the foundation for the first fixed battery. And that fixed battery came out of a collaboration with one of his graduate students, Ralph Raytan, who modified and systematized these tests into that battery, which today we call the Halstead-Raytan battery. I guarantee you've given tests from this battery, even if you haven't done the traditional fixed battery itself. If any of you guys have given groove pegboard test, or the finger tapping test, some of those, the speech sounds perception test, seashore rhythm test. Those are all Halstead rattan tests. He added some of these on top of what Halstead already had, like the sensory perception test, the motor test, the aphasia screen. He fleshed that out in terms of the norms. He created something that they used to use called the impairment index. That book there, the Revised Comprehensive Norms, if you ever see that sitting on a shelf, that relates to the Halstead rattan battery. And these are just some examples of tests that you might run into in this approach. So Trails A, Trails B, the booklet category test, the one on the bottom right, that's the tactual performance test. So those are just some examples. However, the fixed batteries, one could argue that they are relatively inflexible and lengthy. Do patients really want to sit and take 8 hours of tests? As one potential criticism. In response, there was a briefer flexible battery approach developed by Arthur Benton out of the University of Iowa. So we would call this the Iowa Benton approach. The focus here was on a more time-efficient, quantitative measurement of a sufficient number of cognitive domains, just what you need to answer that referral question, or based on hypotheses that you might form during clinical interview or records review. This is a very, again, time-efficient model of assessment. Often they would do feedback the same day as testing. Patient comes in, by noon they're done testing and you're doing feedback, and that's it. Some examples of tests, and I included the book off to the left there if you're interested in looking that up further. Facial recognition test, if you've ever given that. A lot of folks have given JOLO, the judgment of line orientation. There's also, the right-left orientation test, the visual form discrimination test. So if you run into these, you have had some exposure to Benton tests. Within the flexible approach, there are 3 conceptual frameworks. There's more of a Lurian investigation style. There's cognitive neuropsychology, which draws more from sort of the European model that focuses on information processing. And then there's the process approach, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. With Lurian investigation, I won't belabor this too much, but essentially, when you think about Luria, and what he used to do was a lot of bedside testing and syndrome analysis. So he would do these techniques on individuals and kind of, infer and come to a conclusion about what was going on and where that was localized in the brain. He actually first said to even do, know what test to give somebody, you had to conduct a preliminary evaluation of the patient. It's a pretty flexible approach. It's fairly qualitative. Again, I think bedside testing when I think this one. The cognitive neuropsychology approach, rather than just the patient themselves, this one draws kind of more from like a theoretical standpoint. In particular, the benchmark here is a theory of normal cognitive functioning. This approach draws inference from behavioral dissociations to understand the underlying cognitive structure. And then we have the process approach. So this one I'm going to talk about a little more. This involves an analysis of qualitative aspects of performance and errors to really inform the examiner about deficits and abilities. So this one was developed by Norman Geschwind. I mentioned Edith Kaplan, and there's also Harold Goodglass, and this approach is formally called the Boston process approach. And so hopefully there's some fans in the audience today. This emphasizes a flexible qualitative battery approach to assessment. It really seeks to characterize an individual's cognitive strengths and weaknesses. The idea came out of, there are these multiple routes to any solution, and the end product may not be as important as how the patient actually got to that solution. So there's a number of methods you could use to study this, looking at how the patient approached testing, what kind of errors they were making. If you did something called testing limits, were they able to get there? An example with that, so like let's say you're giving block design to a patient. They're putting their blocks together. Darn it, you run out of time. Do you tell them to go ahead and mess the blocks up and then start the next item? Or do you let the timer run and make a note for yourself, of course, for scoring purposes, but let that timer run and see, can they actually get there? If you give them a little more time, can they arrive at that solution? So it's not as much can they do it or not, it's if they get that extra time, and that can actually really inform functional recommendations, okay? So some examples of tests you might see in a Boston process approach. Again, these are commonly used today. The CBLT is a really great example. The Boston naming test, you know, when we talk about error types, that's a really great one. The Ray complex figure test, the Wisconsin card sorting, those would all be good examples. And I have a few more kind of schematics here to show, I think, what's really interesting about the Boston process approach. So take the Ray complex figure, for example. You know, you might look at somebody, comparing here in this photo, we have sort of what we consider, I guess, more of a normal healthy control at the bottom. And then somebody who has some neurologic deficits would be that top row. And you can see, you know, somebody who's a normal healthy control, you know, they take more of an efficient approach to organizing this design. They can look at it and get the gestalt or see it for what it is on the go. And then they can fill in the details from there, versus somebody who might have some cognitive deficits, who has a completely fragmented view of this design. And you can see that kind of play out in their ability to recall components of that design later on. They can't see that gestalt or the whole design as it is. And again, clock drawing. I couldn't get through a talk like this without talking about clock drawing. So clock drawing, you know, it is elegant in its simplicity. It tells you so much about the person in front of you. So there's a couple ways you could kind of think about clock drawing. You could think about it in the kind of same patient over time as they progress. So that would be this drawing over here with the arrow. You know, you say you test a patient several different times. They come back to you for repeat evals. You know, you see them that first time around, the clock looks good. They've got the concept of a clock. They've got their numbers. The hands are at the right positions. But then you watch that clock deteriorate over time. So again, qualitatively, you can describe what's happening to this individual as a function of their disease process. They start to slowly lose the concept of what a clock is. Those numbers drop off. The hands drop off. The clock becomes less organized over time as their impairment progresses in severity. You can also see differences in clocks between disease entities. So you can compare, there have been lots of papers characterizing qualities of the clock drawing in both command and copy scenarios across processes like normal healthy controls versus the types of errors that you would see in somebody with Alzheimer's versus a vascular dementia versus a more subcortical dementia, also like Parkinson's. And Boston naming too is you know, you can easily look at different types of errors. This is a fascinating one, you know, when you're giving this one to patients. So what you might see in somebody with Alzheimer's is semantic errors. So instead of pretzel, like you would see this drawing of a pretzel here, they might say cookie or cracker, you know, something in the snack category, versus somebody with a more subcortical type dementia, say Parkinson's disease with dementia, who has perceptual errors. Instead of seeing a pretzel, they might see a snake or a knot of string. The other one down below, the igloo, you know, in terms of semantic errors, like in somebody with Alzheimer's, they might say like a hut instead of an igloo, something kind of in a related semantic category. Somebody with a Lewy body dementia, more subcortical profile that has like perceptual issues, that might give you something. One I've heard with this one is tortoiseshell. You know, so you're kind of looking at it and you're like, it's definitely not a tortoiseshell, but I could see perceptually if somebody saw that, they might mistake it for that. And so just in the last like minute or two, I want to talk about neuropsychology today. So we've talked a lot about neuropsychology in the past, and where does that leave us now? So what is neuropsychology today? I've talked a lot about different approaches, testing paradigms, and this and that. So essentially, if I had to define neuropsychology, it would be the study of brain structure and functioning as it relates to cognitive, psychological, and behavioral processes. And that is not just clinical. So notice I didn't say clinical neuropsychology, because neuropsychology is both an experimental and a clinical field. So it involves both the study and application to health and disease across research and clinical contexts. It's used for a variety of purposes. So I think the kind of long-standing tradition of neuropsychology was differential diagnosis, you know, identifying when a performance profile matches an archetypal pattern that we recognize as dementia of the Alzheimer's type, or a general medical condition, or a psychiatric condition like schizophrenia. We also use it a lot these days for risk stratification. So neuropsych assessment gets used pre-surgically for things like deep brain stimulator evaluations, high intensity frequency ultrasound pre-surg evals, transplant evals, cancer surgery evaluations, epilepsy surgery. And also these days, and I think kind of where part of it's headed in the future, is there's going to be more emphasis on the quality of life piece and what our evaluations bring to that. You know, really using what we find to develop good functional recommendations that inform safety and capacity, ability to perform activities of daily living, candidacy for different treatments or interventions like cognitive rehabilitation or psychotherapy or, you know, things of that nature. What is neuropsychology not? It's not a competency, and I say this because neuropsychology itself is a recognized specialty. Neuropsychological assessment may be a competency, but neuropsychology is a specialty in and of itself. We are actually not the sole user of cognitive testing, and that's perfectly fine. In most states, at least in the US, neuropsychology is not a protected legal title, but it does ethically relate to competency and scope of practice. And there's a couple papers that start to get at this issue, especially with regard to the levels of testing, and I've included those references here. Neuropsychology Today, the training standards may vary by country. Some countries, especially internationally, a lot of countries require the master's degree. Others, including the US, require a doctorate. In the US, recognized training standards include the Houston Guidelines and more recently the CRISP taxonomy that relates to programs, while the guidelines relate more to trainees. In the States right now, the ultimate mark of specialization is board certification, and in the future, maintenance of certification. It's already becoming a thing, and I think will continue to be a thing. This is just a mapping of the timeline of some of the organizations that have developed just here in the United States, with organizations at the bottom and board certifying bodies at the top. And I've also included the Houston Guidelines and CRISP taxonomy. So you can see, remember when I mentioned earlier that the field really started becoming more widespread in the 60s. So you can see starting in 67, look at the explosive growth here in the United States of all these organizations just in our country alone. And I don't have space for all of them, but we've also expanded to include regional organizations like the Midwest Neuropsych Group or the Pacific Northwest Neuropsych Group, state-based neuropsychology organizations, and in some instances, city organizations. So Houston Neuropsych Society, for example, you know, is a city-based group. So you may look a little more online at your own state and see if there's one operating. And more impressive, I think, has just been the rapid growth of neuropsychology around the world. I do a lot of work within the International Neuropsychological Society, and it's taught me a lot about global neuropsychology, and it's, you know, really enriching, I think, to interact with our international colleagues and learn from them and what they're doing. And these are just a smattering of the organizations I could find currently. There's probably others. So where are we heading in the future? Back in 1987, Paul Meehl, who's a psychologist, called for us to embrace technology. And it was probably around that time that neuropsych began questioning ourselves. Well, you know, we should probably be using computer-based assessments. But really the conclusion at this point is we're still falling far behind that. Tom Parsons is a large proponent of neuropsychology of the future and kind of integrating technology into what we're doing. And he had a publication that came out recently. And what this does is this compares citations in the literature for whatever the discipline is, neuropsychology, neurology, neuroscience, and then you add that word computer to it, just to look at how many representative publications there are. And as you can see, neuropsychology lags far behind our medical and our neuroscience colleagues. So we really need to make up some ground here. I think in the future, you know, if somebody was to ask me, where do we think neuropsychology is heading? There was this NIH Brain Initiative about a decade ago, challenging all of us to move our specialties forward and create novel approaches and novel ways of managing and sharing data. I think this will continue to be the case for neuropsychology. So the National Neuropsychology Now initiative is ongoing, and this is going to be a large multi-center data collection effort. As everybody can tell with the COVID crisis, teleneuropsychology is becoming a thing. I think it will continue to be a thing. There's groups around the country that study neuropsychological assessment in VR contexts. So Skip Rizzo, Maria Schultheis, Tanya Giovanetti, these are examples of individuals you might look into more if you're interested in this area. Dan Drain here at Emory is studying how to make measures, in particular memory measures, using video real-world scenarios. It's really fascinating. And of course, there's a plethora of mobile apps now, wearable monitors, eye tracking, multisensory devices that people are looking at in a research context to see how that helps us capture additional data that may be of use in assessments. I'll skip really quickly through the last few because I know we're out of time, but other efforts are increasing the verisimilitude of our measures. We really want to improve our understanding of how the patient actually performs in real life situations. Because if you're doing testing on a patient, you may hear them say, okay, so I'm connecting these dots, but how does that tell me how I'm going to be a good lawyer or a good doctor or good at my job in my real life? And there's these other tests that are, kind of developed to be more naturalistic in terms of what they're measuring and try to mimicking actual cognitive demands in daily life. And then, of course, increasing representation of diverse populations. So in our measures, in our norms, taking great consideration to things like ethnic identity, gender identity, representing multilingualism, being more culturally sensitive with the measures that we make and use, ensuring that we have measures that can be administered to people with physical or sensory disabilities, like deaf or hard of hearing populations, for example. So the long and short of it, thanks for those that have stuck with me so far, but neuropsychology is a rich history. We found a home in a variety of places. I think we're continuing to evolve in our scope, our methods, and our presence. And, we hear a lot about, technology and AI and deep learning, and is that going to replace what we're doing? I don't think we're going anywhere anytime soon as a field. I think there will continue to be a role for neuropsychology, and I'm excited to see where we all take it. So thanks again for your time and attention. Hopefully you found this as interesting as I do. I geek out on this stuff. As my moderator so kindly mentioned before, I do have a book coming out. If you want to know more about some things related to neuropsych training and competencies, be on the lookout for that. And again, I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Block. That was such a very wonderful and thorough presentation. I know we didn't get as many questions as we usually do, but that's probably a testament to how thorough you were with detailing the history of neuropsychology across time. I know I certainly learned a lot, even of things I thought I already knew. So thank you.
It's good to get a refresher.
Definitely. So a few questions we did get. I want to kind of start with this broad overarching question. So it seems like overall there is this kind of connectionist versus localization view that's been debated across the history of neuropsychology. Mm-hmm. Do you see our field today as currently being more on one side or the other?
I think that's a good question. I think it's both. I think that most of us ascribe more to an integrative kind of viewpoint where we balance the two. And so that would be my answer, both. I can expound on that if they like. But.
No, I think that's good. And I agree. It does seem like both seem to be the primary view right now. So the next question we got was related to Renaissance and antiquity views that you discussed. So, and this was a rather long question, so we did kind of parse it down a little bit just to get to the meat of it. So are there some things you think that we can learn from the Renaissance antiquity views in neuropsychology that we could potentially integrate or reintegrate into clinical practice or modern research methodology?
Wow, that's a really good question. One thing, I mean, this may not necessarily be answering directly the question, but when you, and I talked about this a little bit, I wish I could have put this more, but a lot of the antiquity in particular talked about localization of mentation and where that lied, whether it was the heart or the brain, but also included things like the heart and the gut. And a lot of times with neuropsychologists, we think brain, 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 and that's true. I mean, that's part of what we do, but cognitive function can also be influenced by other body systems. And so if I can include a little bit of a nod, I'm working on my second book currently, and it's going to be a revival of the medical neuropsychology series. And really that comes from an interest of mine in having a decent reference for us and a place where trainees can learn about how does the cardiovascular system impact cognitive functioning and brain function? What about digestion? Things like malnutrition and obesity. How about renal and hepatic function? And so I think when I think antiquity, a lot of what I kept reading, and I tried to trim it down for this presentation, was they were localizing not just the brain, but other body organs and body systems. And I think if we can go back to that a little bit as neuropsychologists and not always limit ourselves to primary CNS disorders, because if we're going to be viable as a field, I think general medical is a great area to expand to and do research in. We really need it.
All right. I think just being mindful of time, we'll do one more question. So there has been some discussion in the field as of late about kind of a universal descriptor system for performance in neuropsychology or on neuropsychological tests. Do you see any pros or cons of that approach, kind of thinking back through this history of where we are today?
You guys are asking some really kick-butt questions here. I like this. So I didn't have time to get to this in this presentation, unfortunately, but I'm glad you asked. We actually just did a case conference on this topic here at Emory recently. It's a problem in the field. If we don't have a common language or a common metric that we're all sharing, if we're getting reports from one another or trying to communicate across referring specialties, it can be really confusing. And I'm very big on writing a very consumer-oriented report. And I think we always have to keep that in mind. And I think we have to think about what our referring sources want to see. And there's actually been a few kind of survey attempts to look at that and what they prefer. And they want something that's simple and clear and easy to understand. There was like a guidelines statement that just came out recently, and I think it was published in TCN, but it was a work group there, AACN, that looked at this issue and made a recommendation. There have been other studies looking at kind of modified or adapted systems, because when you think about it, so there's like the Wechsler system, there's the sort of Heaton system, and one of us are usually trained on one or the other. We use a weird combination of the two. And so other attempts have been made to look at that. I know Mike Schoenberg at a USF in Florida, he had a great paper on something he called the Q-simple system that sort of modifies and combines the two. What I see is a lot of neuropsychologists agree on everything from normal on up. Where we have a lot of problems agreeing is everything below normal. But that's the most critical part, because we're 9 times out of 10 not being asked to look at giftedness, but being asked to look at deficits, right? And so it's very problematic. I don't know that this guideline statement necessarily resolves something with 100% certainty, but I do encourage you, if you haven't read that paper, please dig it out, read it, you know, have that conversation with your colleagues and your trainees or your peers, because I do think it's a really critical issue that our field does need to come to consensus to.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Block, for this presentation. And everyone join us next week with Dr. Amanda Gooding on providing feedback to patients and families.